Hello, I am Joel McLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome to the 905er. When I say the term sex work, what runs through your mind? At some point, I am certain some seedy thoughts crept into your imagination. Words like victimization and trafficking are synonymous with the concept of sex work. The general idea in the public consciousness is that this is an unsafe and dangerous line of work to be in. But why is that? Back in 2012, the Supreme Court of Canada handed down a landmark ruling which struck down many of the laws surrounding prostitution and sex work in Canada, citing that the laws violated sex workers' charter rights as they imposed a greater risk of harm on sex workers. The court at that time gave then the Stephen Harper government time to rewrite the laws to make them compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The result was the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, a law which at that time was viewed as just rearranging the deck chairs on the issue and did not actively address the issues surrounding safety of sex work in Canada. In 2015, Justin Trudeau, in his first campaign, promised to rescind the law. However, that never happened. And to this date, the law is still on the books and still in effect, although that may not be for much longer. In a repeat of 2012, last month, sex worker advocates took action and filed a lawsuit in Ontario courts to challenge the constitutionality of the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Should they succeed in their challenge, laws surrounding sex work, again, could be struck down in Canada, forcing the government to once again update its laws. One of the groups involved with the court case is a Hamilton advocacy group, Sex Workers Action Program Hamilton, or SWAP Hamilton. We reached out to their executive director, Yelena Vermillion, to chat about the court case and what they hope to accomplish if they succeed. As well, we discussed with her the issue of sex work and sex workers' rights in general in Canada. We would like to give our listeners a word of caution before beginning the episode, as we do talk about sensitive and mature topics in this episode, and, well, our language can get rather frank in this one. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good morning.
Well, we'd like to thank Yelena Vermillion. Did I get your name right? I just want to make sure I did pronounce that correctly before
You
we...
did. Very
wonderful.
impressive.
Wonderful. I worked with Yelena once back in the day. But I'd like to thank you from SWAP Sex Workers Alliance Project Hamilton. Action Project.
Action Program, sorry.
Action Program. My geez.
That's okay. They're like all, it's regardless, it's just like an organization for sex workers. You're good.
Well, SWAP Hamilton, we'll go with that for coming onto the podcast today because the landmark repeat court action that you are involved with, along with numerous other sex workers rights groups across the country, or across the province, I should say, to challenge the criminal code on sex work. Can you just give our listeners kind of an insight maybe into what your argument is that you're presenting to the court?
For sure. So the basis of this case is a human rights case. It's a constitutional challenge, which means that the human rights of I'm going to get this wrong. I always say it wrong. The Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. There we go. Canadian. That's what it is. But I sound like an idiot, but I know what I'm referring to. Anyway, so there's multiple sections of it, and it applies to all Canadians. Sex workers are among that demographic, and they should be protected by the Charter. And a lot of these laws, our arguments claim in the case that it's violating their rights, and many of them. So, for example, we have multiple laws. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6 sections of the criminal code that all tackle various intersecting parts of the industry. So like section 213 criminalize workers who communicate for the purpose of, selling sexual services in public spaces. 286.11 criminalizes clients who are going to purchase the services. And then we have like different parts of the criminal code that are criminalizing the other parts. So we have material benefits. So we have, if someone is like helping operating your website and you pay them to do that, that's like a material benefit off the back of your sex work. And so they've criminalized anybody who's like helping you, in your business ventures is essentially what that is. And they've criminalized those. And the two other sections are 286.3.1 and 286.4. The one is procuring. So it's the idea that if a sex worker friend of mine didn't have a credit card and needed to ask me to put up an ad, that would make me a pimp under the criminal law. It would make me a procurer. And like these criminal laws are sort of misinterpreted and like misapplied on purpose to exacerbate the public idea that sex workers are victims in need of being rescued and that they're unable to protect themselves. And then the last section, 286.4, is advertising. So even advertising your own sexual services, someone else's sexual services, in that same example that I gave you. So there's two parts of that. Like if my friend asked me to help them put up an ad, there's two parts of that would be criminalized. The actual putting up of the someone else's sexual services, and also facilitating someone else selling out someone else's sexual services. So there's two parts that become criminalized. It really isolates people who are in the sex industry. It violates their rights, specifically to the right to life, liberty, and security, which is Section 7 of the Charter, the right to equality and non-discrimination, which is Section 15 of the Charter, the right to freedom of expression, which is 2B, and the right to freedom of association, most importantly, 2D. Right of association specifically is important when we're talking about workers who need to organize and haven't had the opportunity to unionize in a formal fashion under current health and safety regulations, occupational health and safety law. So
I just there's something I want to clarify though. My understanding of the criminal code, and you're probably more of an expert on this section than I am, the actual exchanging of money for sex is not illegal. Do I have that correct?
No, and that's something that the conservative government purposefully spoon-fed to the public as lies to confuse us. And so we have to think of the context. So part of the previous, you said this is a repeat, and you are correct in saying that. It is a repeat lawsuit. It's a redundant repeat. And the reason why the government got away with the current criminal laws is they just changed a few words. When the 2013-2014 case of Bedford, which is 3 sex workers bringing the government to court, it was Amy Lebovich, Terry Jean Bedford, and Valerie Scott. I've met all of them. They're my friends. They're really wonderful idols of mine, and they have they brought forth an argument to the government basically that the laws at that time, which were similar but slightly different to how the regime is currently structured. Back then, it did aim to, discourage people entering sex work by criminalizing, again, all of the other parts of the transaction, the third party, the person selling or purchasing the services, pardon me. But at that time, actual sex workers selling their services wasn't illegal. Like, that wasn't a crime. The difference is that after the Bedford case, those provisions, 3 provisions, were struck down, found to be unconstitutional. It basically, the summary of that case was essentially that when sex workers followed the law, it put them into harm's way, and when they didn't follow the law, they were criminalized. And so it would put them between a rock and a hard place, and they proved that to the government. The Supreme Court vindicated that those laws were struck down, and then Parliament was provided 1 year to institute new laws, or at that time, if they didn't institute new laws, at that time, sex work would have been like de facto or effectively decriminalized. Stephen Harper's conservative government at the time, and you have to understand contextually, he also removed like a very important program for I think it was economic program for single women at that time. So he was like, this was like a multi kind of attack on marginalized women, people who don't have the same like access to income, or there is a very gendered thing. And because when we're talking about sex workers, we're talking about people who make up the industry, and that's predominantly, yes, women, and also people who live with disabilities, trans and non-binary people who are racialized, Indigenous, Asian, Black, or otherwise racialized. We have a huge people who are parents, single mothers. Like there's a lot of history of people who are just trying to get by and then they're criminalized because of that. And it's unfortunate. So the law in Bedford was struck down. Stephen Harper was like, okay, we're going to bring in a new law. And basically all they did was change a few of the words and change the way that the wording was structured such that it wasn't technically violating, but in the spirit of things, they violated the spirit of Supreme Court's decision. They disrespected the Supreme Court. And they were like, and we have to think about this. This is monumental. Like sex workers have been maligned throughout history. I think of Eileen Wuornos, and like, yes, she was a murderer and among other things, but she was tried 7 times and convicted 7 times. And there's no other serial killer that's been convicted 7 separate times in 7 different jurisdictions. And it was just like, it's just sort of like a way of crucifying sex workers and sort of putting them through the ringer. And we didn't go back on laws on abortion. We didn't go back on laws on homosexuality, or I didn't mean to say it like that, but in Canada. But we did go back on laws on sex work because we don't respect sex workers. So these new laws, the difference between the laws before the Bedford case and after the Bedford case are that the sale of sexual services is now a crime. It is a crime for someone to sell their sexual services, but there is written into the law what the government likes to peddle, the lie that I sort of spoke to earlier about spoon feeding, is there is an immunity for prosecution for one selling their own sexual services. But but people don't understand that if your activity is listed and captured in the criminal code, you're still a criminal, whether or not the police have the ability or the freedom to arrest you. You could be a drug trafficker who is like immune from arrest because you've made a deal with the province or whatever, the crown. But like, that doesn't mean that you're not considered a criminal. You're still going to be surveilled. You're still going to have a file on you with CSIS or the police or whatever. They're still going to like have tabs. You're considered a criminal.
So the question that, the critics of your argument, and I'll play devil's advocate here. The critics are going to say, well, these laws are there to protect, human trafficking, child exploitation, stuff that I think we can all agree are despicable and should be outlawed. And that's what these laws
are. They're already outlawed. That's the thing, though. People don't understand that, like, these laws, sex work laws, removing these laws do not harm people who are human trafficked. And I think, speaking about human trafficking, like, I do have particular expertise. I was actually hired as an expert witness for the defense in the Voodoo case, which was a previous constitutional challenge to a particular couple of provisions in the criminal code. And it was basically, I was explaining to the judge why sex workers would hire a third party, because in this particular case, we had a Black man who was hired legitimately by a sex worker as a driver. They entered a romantic relationship. And then in that romantic relationship, there was domestic violence. And so, and like they used drugs, because like, who doesn't use drugs? And like, whether it's caffeine or sugar or whatever, marijuana or all of it, like, who cares? Beer, like, they're all drugs. And so the police intervened, and because she had a large amount of drugs on her, she was basically coerced into testifying against this man who is Black. And they sort of vilified the sex work as it intersected with like the domestic violence, and they called it human trafficking, when really it was just domestic violence in a relationship where sex work was occurring. And this is unfortunately that case didn't pan out. And but the point being is that this is how human trafficking is used as this sort of red herring, this sort of like moralistic argument of protect the children. Listen, if we want to protect the children, we have to realize that a lot of queer youth are kicked out of their homes early, and they end up doing sex work because it's not safe for them to interact with social services when they're being put, if they're looking for education, for like actual material change in their life and support that's going to help them keep themselves sheltered, keep themselves fed, keep themselves sane. We have to think about survival. And I'm not, no one wants to see children sucking dick for money. Like, this isn't ideal. Like, working isn't ideal. I wouldn't get up and go to 9 to 5 if I didn't have to. Would you? I don't know. I don't hate myself that much. But so there's a context here. Work isn't great, but doesn't mean that people should be kept from doing particular kinds of work if it provides them economic liberation. And so a lot of these arguments, these moral panics, are historically based in this so-called humanitarian do-gooder, but it's misguided and it's misappropriated and it often does harm. So we don't understand that removing the sex work criminal laws actually helps people who are human trafficking victims, because even human trafficking victims, when they are captured in the law, they're often forced to testify. It's re-traumatizing. They're not even necessarily provided the agency and what kind of services to quote unquote rescue them they provide. There's a lot of infantilization that happens. And actually, if you go on my YouTube, there's a perfect comment. I should probably pull it up because I think it's a great way to, someone who had been human trafficked commented on one of the videos I had did. It was just like the interview on Canada Tonight with Janella Masala. And the person had said, I survived human trafficking, and quite frankly, the criminalization of the abuse of my traffickers subjecting me to were done specifically to force me to break the law. Decriminalization forces accountability in cases like mine and many other survivors. So we have to understand that, like, often criminal law is not effective in, reaching its objective. And the objective of the particular law that we have now is to abolish prostitution, as they call it. It's not meant to protect anybody. They believe that sex workers experiencing this violence as collateral damage is acceptable. They believe that violating sex workers' charter rights are acceptable because they believe that we are not worthy of protection or respect or dignity. They believe that murders like Picton should be allowed, and they believe that the stigma should be reinforced because they believe that no one should ever enter sex work, because they themselves as individuals cannot imagine a world where they could suck dick for money. Well, I can't imagine a world where I worked in a sewer. So God bless those that do, and God bless those that do sex work, because not everybody has this particular skills. So, I think that ultimately the arguments that the Crown, the Attorney General of Canada is making is that sex work is bad and we wouldn't want to do it and we wouldn't want our daughters. And it's ultimately just a moral anti-sex puritanical argument that's been rehashed and recycled and, just sort of repackaged and put under the guise of human trafficking to make people, it's an obfuscation. It's a purposeful confusion, and it's a purposeful scapegoat to stop people from realizing that it doesn't matter if you should respect sex work or the work itself, or if you would do it yourself. It's about human rights.
So I mean, it's a long held cliche that sex work has been around for a long time. The old phrase of the oldest profession and all those things. And it always seems to me that if over the course of human history, no society has ever stopped people selling sex for money, then really passing laws is a waste of time. And the thing that matters here is that the people who engage in sex work are safe and protected. And right now, that's the exact opposite of what seems to take place. That the criminalization, it may discourage some people from going into that line of work. But who knows if it does or not, frankly, I would imagine. But what it guarantees, and I was seeing this on your website, the implications that arise from criminalization are, for instance, someone being arrested by the police and being found to have condoms on them.
Yeah.
Well, that's a sign that you're working as a sex worker. So safe sex can be evidence of prostitution or sex work.
Exactly.
So maybe you could talk a bit more about that, about why the system as we have it just doesn't work.
Well, ultimately, I think I think broadly it relates a lot to like safe supply, and it relates, I think, we look at the current labor strike and the whole province, like an injury to one is an injury to all. So if any woman could be criminalized for carrying a condom and be called a prostitute, and that the prostitution is like illegal and it's a criminal act, and like you wouldn't want to be a bad girl, would you? It's all of you to control women and their bodies and what they do. And I mean, not only women do sex work, and I validate that, but nonetheless, they are predominantly the majority of the industry. And I think that it's just a way to stop people from engaging in things that they want to engage in, because there's so many like I don't know, like they couldn't see themselves doing it themselves, so they have to stop other people from living their life, and it's just like this weird.
And certainly the narrative that certainly I grew up with was that, you know, nobody chooses to do this. Everybody is forced into it in one way or another. I mean, would you be willing to sort of speak about that for a few minutes about why someone might choose to be a sex worker?
Well, I mean, for me personally, like I grew up watching, like I'm of English descent, like, well, British. There's parts of the Isles from my mom's side, but anyways, mostly English. And I grew up watching, not grew up, but as a younger person, I watched, Secret Diary of Call Girl with Billie Piper, and I grew up with like different media representations of sex workers that weren't necessarily terrible. And for me personally, like I was always curious. I always thought of sex work with curiosity long before I did it. And like I didn't have sex till I was 18 by choice, and obviously I don't know, I've always had a healthy approach to sexuality, and so I think that that's like really positively informed my work. But I started sex work because I was homeless and I needed some quick cash to get an apartment by myself because I had just had like a domestic situation and I needed to figure out my housing situation. It was unstable, and the reasons why I started doing sex work, those choices or those reasons, like they evolved, and the reasons why I do sex work now are a little bit different because like it provides stability, and like I live with disabilities, like I have the disability tax credit, like I live with permanent disabilities, and they're mostly mental and emotional because I grew up. And like, yeah, like, sure, we'll get into the trope of I was abused as a child and whatever that means to people. And like, they can think of me as a brain damaged, stupid hooker or whatever they want to think about me. But like, that's fine. Like, we have to, ultimately, like, we're trying to have our rights vindicated in the law because it doesn't matter what people think about us. We should have the freedom to behave and to do what we want as long as we're engaging in things that are consensual. And I think that, like, you know, whether you like, it's like the whole disgust with like homosexual sex. It's just like the same thing. It's the same like pushback, like, oh no, sex for money, and like this whole idea of we're gonna steal your husbands, or like nobody. It's just, yeah, it's frustrating.
There's something you just mentioned there about the consensual aspect of it, and I think it's not the problem that people are. When it comes down to it, ultimately, you know, you'll know this better than I would. Like, is it still predominantly like a consensual act between two adults?
Work a consensual act?
Yeah, like when it comes down to it, sex workers are engaging in a consensual act between consenting adults. It's just you throw in money there.
Or camera.
Well, camera is legal. Camera is pornography, and you can put it on the internet apparently. So,
yeah,
I mean if you really want to get down to it, just turn your apartments into a film studio, put a camera in it.
People are fucking for less than $300. People are fucking for a McDonald's meal. You know what I mean? Like, people are fucking.
Well, you tell me.
I mean, I'm telling you that exchanges for sex happen all the time. They're normal. Mm-hmm. The fact that we criminalize a particular kind of exchange is meant to disenfranchise those that are mostly marginalized in the industry from accessing their own economic liberation. And I did mention that the whole Stephen Harper removed the tax credit for, I forget, it was mothers or whatever at the time. I did write a speech about it a while ago for the vigil for the women. And I mentioned it at the vigil for the women that we held on Barton Street a few months ago, but I forget, it's off the top of my head. But yeah, like it's ultimately a way to disenfranchise people from accessing economic liberation. And these moral arguments are used as like a way to justify it.
So my understanding is that the most sex workers and sex work organizations aren't asking for legalization and actually don't prefer correct. Legalization. Is that correct? It's decriminalization that would be the preferred route. Is that correct? Can you explain why that is?
So legalization would be like, so first of all, decriminalization, I'll start with decriminalization. Decriminalization is just the removal of all criminal penalties and things that and other related laws that impact sex workers or that are used to police sex workers. So, for example, we have the Criminal Code of Canada and the provisions that we're challenging in this case, but we also have the I think it's IRPR, Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. There's parts of that, for example, where if you are not a citizen or a permanent resident in Canada, you have a work permit likely, and that work permit, every work permit in red ink on it says that it's not to be used in the sex industry. And any migrant worker in Canada, and most migrant workers in most legal regimes around the world, if you do sex work as a person who does not have status as a PR or a citizen, you can be deported. And I often the reason why it's really important to understand sex work as a labor issue and how it's disenfranchising workers at the end of the day is that we have international students paying 3 times the tuition, and then we also stop them from working to get a wage that could pay off that tuition. It's not just migrant workers that are disenfranchised. It's workers in general. Like we working class people are oppressed. This is a terrible time. So we're fighting back, and that's all we can really do, because we've been asking there was supposed to be a 5-year review of the criminal law, PCPA, Bill C-36, what we currently have when it came out, but it took them 7 years, and they only started doing it once we filed the lawsuit. So it's a joke.
What would the difference between a decriminalized
I'm so sorry,
a fully legalized one? What is that distinction to you?
Thank you. I have ADHD, so thanks for bringing me back into focus.
Me too.
Sorry, it's not just what I think. I can definitely parse it out for you. I just definitely went off on a tangent. It's the morning. I had my latte. Hopefully it kicks in soon.
Yeah, I was saying.
Okay, so decriminalization is removing of criminal penalties and like the other parts of laws that are used to police sex workers. In a legalized framework, you'd have, unfortunately, the government is pimp, because you'd have like some arbitrary regulations. You might have suggestion of mandatory testing, which absolutely not. Like, if sex workers, generally speaking, institute better health and personal hygiene practices and are more diligent in protecting themselves sexually than your average Tinder date. So we have to look at human rights here. And if we wouldn't want, unless everybody who's having sex is getting tested mandatorily, we wouldn't want, sex workers. We wouldn't want a database of sex workers. We wouldn't want to have licenses or paying fees, because it would create a tier of sex workers who you'd have people who could afford to pay the licensing fees, that could afford to do, whatever the government arbitrarily requires or the province requires to be a legal sex worker. And then you'd have those that can't, and then they would be illegal. And then you'd have the same system we look at Saint Nazaire, France, when in the 70s, when the sex workers occupied the church, they had so many single mothers who were being fined for doing sex work. And they were like, how do you expect to pay those fines? They were exorbitant. And so the police were just pimping these women. And that's what would happen in a legalized regime, is that you'd have like exploitation of sex workers. And they'd be like, it's just like what you see, like with the pot shops, like everyone's going hog wild. I'm not saying you'd have a brothel on every corner or like you'd have 30 fucking pot shops, or like, head shops, quote unquote, in I know, in Hamilton, but it would be taken advantage of. And so on a decriminalized regime, you have people who could operate under the means of their own production. They would have no sort of like enforcement of police, because sex workers know that criminalization and police are a source of harm in their lives, and we've been saying this for decades. Legalization would just perpetuate a system of infantilization, and often would re-traumatize and re-victimize sex workers by putting them in databases. And you would have people who would exploit those databases, who would unlawfully access them for that information.
Just occurred to me the distinction between no one decriminalized what I do for a living, like working on a computer. That was never, no one ever legalized that. Sorry, better way to put it. It was never illegal in the first place.
But it was never made criminal either.
Yeah. So that's what you're just wanting to be put on the same footing as every other profession.
Exactly.
Where it's not mentioned in the law, because why would it be? Okay. Yeah. That's just properly sunk into my head right this second.
When you talk to New Zealand police, and I mean, I'm happy to provide like I do trainings on this, so I have a lot of video content. And there's one particular interview with a New Zealand police officer where he's like, we wouldn't police plumbers because the acts that they do are lawful. Like there's no, And people don't understand. It's like there's no possibility for a positive relationship with police and sex workers. And sex workers have a lot of information. They know shit. They know all of, they know all of like the important men's details and all of these things.
Well, what strikes me about what you're talking about, and I'll be honest, I was more in the lines of the legalization point of view, but you gave me something to think about there. But if you think about like I think it comes down to, I'm thinking like the straight-laced portion of society that thinks of sex work as this dirty, sinful part of society, child exploitation, trafficking, all that bad stuff that happens. But what you're talking about is if you reform it so you decriminalize it, sex workers yourselves can organize. I mean, clearly you already are organized with across the country, but if you organize into, say, your own unions, you're able to protect yourselves. You can also weed out the traffickers. It's easier to market and legitimize yourselves so that you're able to weed out, where are the actual bad people doing the bad stuff.
Yeah. And I think, ultimately it's this leering inner police officer that we have to like blame for this like sort of mindset that has us continually being like, where's the bad guy? Where's the bad guy? Like, the bad guy is in all of us. Like, we have to understand. And it's not people who do sex work that is the problem. It's that we find a reason to like vilify people who are just trying to get by. And yeah, I think that, again, underscoring, when you remove criminal law about sex work that speaks about sex work, you do not remove laws of general application that currently exist for kidnapping, for sexual assault, for all of these other things that could occur, which are kidnapping, etc., which occur in the provision of human trafficking, whether that's for sexual labor or whether that's for general labor. Because often, the obfuscation of trafficking, people don't often consider that the majority of trafficking that occurs in Canada is labor exploitation, not sexual exploitation.
Right.
And there's also a lot more domestic violence in the home than there is human trafficking, full stop. But we have millions and millions of dollars that have been misappropriately, in my opinion, allocated towards quote unquote human trafficking programs that, in my opinion, just siphon funds away from social services for the general public in the guise of helping police and helping these trafficked women. And there's a racialized component to that as well, because often these women are thought of in the general consciousness as Asian women. And it's this whole infantilization of these poor Asian women are going to have to suck dick and do rub and tugs. And it's like, what if they want to do that? What if they're comfortable doing that? And there's also, there's like an underlying element of like gentrification, because often massage parlors, which are potentially owned and commonly owned by people of Asian descent, it's about removing their ownership of property and like their part of the stigma's strategy is to remove sex workers from the community, to remove people standing in the community as a member of the community. Because if you're not seen as a human being, how could you be allowed to own property and operate a business? So it's like all of these, it's insidious.
The whole sort of, I don't remember 20, 30 years ago, anybody using the word trafficking, because at that time, people were more frank about, well, we just don't like people paying for sex for money. It's morally wrong. End of story.
Exactly.
Whereas I guess now people are much more reluctant to say that. So it's like, okay, so how do we get them? So the whole sort of rise of trafficking seems to me to be a surrogate for trying to stop sex work. I mean, that seems to be the association anyway that I pick up, that trafficking in humans obviously is illegal, always has been, always will be. But I mean, if sex work wasn't criminalized, a lot of the reasons for trafficking would be taken away, wouldn't they? Because it's the illegality that forces people into these avenues.
Exactly. And also we have to understand that, the criminal law also isolates sex workers. So it's actually providing them opportunity, and it fosters situations where exploitation and violence can occur. It's if sex workers are out in the open, or if they have their own, like if they had their own building in the city where like there was a brothel and it was like protected, and like that would be wonderful. And like public health services, like one thing I like to tell people is that I want to live in a world where Swap Hamilton doesn't need to exist, because we should be able as sex workers to access any fucking service that the public could access, because we're parts of the community too. I'm a human being and I live in this community, and just because I, do sex work for a decade or however long you've been doing it, doesn't matter, and what form, it doesn't matter.
I just actually having a question. It's just a slightly tangential question, but so routine tests for basically a routine test for HIV, sexually transmitted diseases, whatever. Obviously, I'd imagine those are things that you want to access now. And I thought in my innocence that those were things that we could all access fairly easily. You just go to a GP or whatever, and I guess we can. But what's your experience of actually accessing that kind of service? Because
it's a great question. I think that's a really good segue. Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, so my goal in answering this question is to basically illuminate that when you decriminalize, you also reduce stigma, which is also like a holistic, positive impact on people in the sex industry. Because because when people access sexual, like if they're getting STBBI testing, sexually transmitted infection, bloodborne infection, they could have a nurse, and part of normal screening is to be asked how many people have you had sex with in the last however many days. And if my answer is legitimately 32, and I have no shame about that, or it's not going to be 32, like that's just like feeding into I make 300 an hour and I'm working every hour of the day, clearly. No. But if that answer is a higher than average number, and that nurse or that medical professional has like a micro reaction, or even like a very obvious reaction of disgust or shame or judgment or whatever it might be, like that discourages people accessing healthcare, and like really that does impact and harm the public health and the public good. And so ultimately, decriminalization is a public health issue. It's a human rights issue. We can't be criminalizing people and then impacting their public health. And there's lots of data, like Swap Hamilton. I've done consultation with Transpulse Canada. You can look at specifically the data about trans and non-binary sex workers and their expectations about access to justice. More than half, I forget that it was 50 something % of trans and non-binary sex workers have unmet healthcare needs in Canada. Like there's a lot of intersecting, situations where the criminal law just compounds harm where there's already people struggling in it. It's unfortunate.
I guess that's what it comes down to in this matter is like criminal. Like it's. I've always found this weird. Like we criminalize sex, yet
yes,
like it's not an abnormal act. Like it's like sex itself is not a between consenting adults.
Yeah,
it's not a harmful act. Yet we seem to have this attitude of, well, we need to criminalize this. We need to punish people for essentially wanting to introduce a financial or some kind of extra exchange. Because you're right. It's not necessarily just financial. It could be, sex for a favor. That you could.
There's lots of bad reasons why people have sex.
There's a lot of reasons why people have sex. Not
people
all of them are good.
For like security, people are fucking for I love yous. People are fucking for chicken nuggets. Like who cares?
There's a whole range. It's a whole spectrum.
People are fucking for drugs, and that sounds like a fun time. But anyways,
but like it's just a hypocrisy on society just to look at say, well, you can have sex for these reasons, but this one reason, I myself have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of, well, just because you exchange money or add money into the equation, it's now it's a bad thing. And I'm like, what? Why? Like if it's done between consenting adults, I'm always on the line.
Because Jesus didn't get a cut, okay? That's why it's bad.
Well, maybe.
I mean, it's exactly the point, though, isn't it? That we used to our laws used to have a lot of religion in them. They used to have a lot of moral judgments in them. And as time has gone on, we have less and less than that because we can't do it in a multicultural society. You know, what Christians think doesn't tally with what other people think. And so this is really almost the last bastion of that kind of the law acting as a moral guardian of our well-being, you know, in very inverted commas here. And it makes no sense when we don't have blasphemy laws anymore. We don't have all kinds of other crazy stuff that we used to have. But for whatever reason, people are very, I mean, I guess, the current federal government promised all kinds of things when it came in. It did legalize cannabis, which I guess decriminalize. I don't know how they
just decriminalized it.
Well, he legalized it.
Okay.
Because it's obviously still criminal to smoke and drive, but that's its own thing. But it's a whole different topic. But it is legalized because they have to ask for licenses to open up businesses related to it, et cetera, et cetera. It's still regulated as like a.
What's your opinion then on the fact that Justin Trudeau got elected on being a feminist prime minister, and he's
a piece of shit. I think that's a farce. And I'm not a fascist, and I'm not like a right winger. Mm-hmm. Like, I can criticize our prime minister. I almost said president. I lived in America for 6 months, and it just stuck with me. I feel bad. But anyways, our prime minister, about his actions, and I think that his optics are like beyond him being someone who uses like feminism as like a thing as part of his image. His party itself, the Liberal Party, as well as the NDP, as well as the Green Party, all have resolved for decriminalization, but they have taken no action on it. And when we talk about the federal case that we're in, this challenge, it's not necessary. The government could change it right now. They don't have to allow us to spend all of this money in labor and legal fees to fight for our rights, to prove that these laws for the second time, because we already did this. We already went through this process 2013, 2014. I say we collectively as sex workers, not like individuals. And this case in particular, if you look at the actual people involved, it's the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform, which is 26 groups across Canada, organizations that provide service to sex workers, including Swap Hamilton, Swan Waterloo, Maggie's Toronto, et cetera, Stella Montreal, and 6 individual applicants. So 5 sex workers, including one former escort agency owner. So, it's broad, and we also have, this is the first case where it's tackling all parts of the interdependent criminal law. I think I'm losing my train of thought at this particular point.
I'll just say we're coming up on our time limit. Sure. So, but I think we'll be definitely following up on this topic only because, sex work isn't going away anytime soon. And
I think it'd be really good to do another episode before long, specifically about the experience in Hamilton, actually, which we haven't gotten to today. And that in itself, I think, would be a really interesting episode to talk about. So
I'm actually trying to film a documentary about sort of like.
Well, when you finish the documentary, let us know. We'd probably like to see it and probably have you on to talk about it more in detail.
Cool. But it might be a long gestation, but I appreciate very much.
We're here for the long haul.
Me too.
But I do want to say thank you for coming onto the podcast today, and we hope that you stay safe out there and you keep well.
Likewise, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate your time. Sorry that we had to play tag a little bit, but I'm glad we made it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So much.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.
Looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.